Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. As we are going through an overview of the Pentateuch, we had just finished up with the book of Leviticus. So we did Genesis, Exodus, and then Leviticus. Leviticus can be a little challenging for some people, not because it's difficult per se. I don't think it's really any more difficult than any other book of the Bible that is dealing with the law specifically, because they're all dealing with the same covenantal requirements, sometimes laid out a little differently or whatever. However, sometimes people, because of how many pastors and Bible teachers kind of mock Leviticus and talk about it as though it's not understandable, boring, ridiculous to attempt any understanding, and it's nothing but laws and misery and all that, they really give it a bad name. It's actually an excellent book, part of what the Bible is built upon, quite frankly. Now, though a Christian isn't under the law, Christians need to understand the law, okay? So what I thought I'd do is I would try to do just a video, because we just finished Leviticus, on a couple of chapters in Leviticus. What I did was I took some pictures of my own Bible that have a few written notes in them, but just to kind of try to show you as I'm going through, how I categorize certain things, and some of the insights that we can gather from reading the Old Testament. And certainly, if you can gather any insights from Leviticus, you're doing good, right? Because it is part of the law, and where it has a lot of information, sometimes people start reading it and they're just not sure what to do with it. Now, I think what we'll do is we'll start with chapter 18, because it talks about the law of holiness, and there's a lot of transference in a sense, though again, Christians aren't under the law. As far as being holy, in the Old Testament, God says to the Jews under the law, "Be holy, for I'm holy." And then Peter quotes it for the Christians in the New Testament. He says, "Be holy, for I'm holy." Obviously quoting actually from Leviticus. So in Leviticus 18, where it starts to talk about the law of holiness, and I'll show you the kind of overview of how the chapters are as a reminder again, but these fall under the purity laws, for different laws and ceremonies regarding purity. Now, this section is applicable for people because there's certain chapters that deal with priests, and then these particular chapters deal with just kind of everybody in the nation of Israel, and then it moves into the priests. Excuse me, I just didn't want to get any calls. So, as you remember, this is kind of the layout. Now, as you look in the square underneath Day of Atonement, you can see purity and then laws and ceremonies. Now, there are some that go back between chapter 11, 15, and they balance out with chapters 18 to 20 with the Day of Atonement in the middle. Now, chapter 16, again, though we're not right now reading the verses, chapter 16, if you read through the verses, deals with how the Day of Atonement is performed. And then chapter 17 actually starts to deal with where it should be performed. Eventually, God is going to make a place for it to be done, and he picks Jerusalem, where his name is going to be, and in the temple that's built there. Until then, it's a feast that's practiced with the tabernacle, which we saw last week, kind of a layout of what it would be. So again, we're starting in chapter 18. So as we look at this, um, like I said, I'll use my own Bible to illustrate. And in the first picture, we have Leviticus 18, 1-4. So I don't know if you can actually read that. If you have a Bible, it says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses," chapter 18. Now, I'm hoping that you can see this this screenshot, but up above where I kind of colored it in blue, this is section 5. Notice it says chapters 18-20, right? Laws regulating the personal relationships of the redeemed people, because it's not dealing with the priests, it's dealing with the people, okay? And then, it says relationships and walk of God's earthly people, and the first heading is unlawful marriages. Now, so he says, "Then the Lord," and really in the Old Testament, when it's all capitals as a reminder, that is God's name, whether you use Jehovah or Yahweh, either one, but it works better to understand it as God using his name as opposed to just reading it as Lord, like master or king or something like that. So, I'll read into it. So it says, "Then Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am Jehovah your God." Specifically, he's Jehovah, right, or Yahweh. And he says, "According to the doings of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, you shall not do." So God didn't want them repeating anything that they get out of Egypt, right? And again, he's going to list unlawful relationships here, starting with marriage, and then he gets into family. But as he does that, these were the things practiced in Egypt. He says, "I don't want you doing what you saw in Egypt," okay? And then he says, "And according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you, you shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances," right? "You shall observe my judgments." And I wrote my own note there for judgments. It just means verdict, which is something determined by God. "And keep my ordinances, which is something that's prescribed." That's a note I wrote there that you can't really see. "To walk in them, I am Jehovah your God." Now he'll repeat this, "I am Jehovah your God," multiple times throughout these chapters at the end, because he's emphasizing the fact that I am your God. Okay, I'm telling you to do this because I am the one that redeemed you. I am the one that is the eternal God. You have a relationship with me, and I want you to represent me. So I'm telling you to do this because I'm your God, right? It's pretty straightforward. So again, this is what they're told to do. Now, as we walk through, in the next picture, we're going to get, at least on the picture part, I'm not going to read all the verses, but you get Leviticus 18, 5-30, okay? Now here, in verse 5, it says, "You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. Again, I am Jehovah," okay? Now, I have a note there that says Proverbs 4:4, Romans 10:5, Galatians 3:12. I wrote those in there. And the reason that I did was because that is where Paul uses, at least in Romans and in Galatians, he uses part of the verse which says, "If a man does them, he shall live by them." Because in both Romans 10 and in Galatians 3:12, it's even little for me. Let me grab my Bible real quick here. And Galatians is the quickest one here. So he's explaining to them that they're not under the law, that if you're under the law, you're under a curse, right? And, Christ was crucified, and basically he took the curse from us. Now, Paul says in Galatians 3:10, for as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone that continues not in all the things which are written in the book of the law to do them. In other words, if you obey the law, if you keep the law, which nobody can keep it perfectly, which is why we need Christ, but if you keep the law, if you're under the law, you need to do them. You need to perform all the statutes and ordinances. There's no separation between moral and ceremonial in the sense that the law can be broken up. It's not like we're supposed to observe certain parts of the law and then not other parts. Obviously, the same morality works through the law because it comes from the nature of God, and it also works into the New Testament because, again, we're dealing with the same God with the same nature. However, if under the law it says not to steal, and then in the New Testament it says not to steal, it's not that stealing is pulled out of the law, but it corresponds because it's still an immorality. Now, based on the 10 Commandments, which are given to Israel, everything revolves around those. In other words, every other law that has come, in a sense, to the Jews is an extension in some way or another and has a relationship to the 10 Commandments. All right. This is most easily seen in Deuteronomy. We'll talk about that when we get there. But Deuteronomy has laws that arise from each of the 10 Commandments, and they're developed throughout the book. So it's not just, these are not just random codes, okay? They're very well organized. And where Paul is quoting from Leviticus in 3:11, he says, but that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God. In other words, you can be in the sight of men. In other words, you obey the law. A person says, wow, that person's righteous. They're obeying the law. Well, they're righteous before men, but they're not. That doesn't mean they're righteous before God. Okay. And he says that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith. He quotes Habakkuk 2:4. And then he says, and the law is not of faith, verse 12, but, and then he quotes this section, but the man that does them shall live in them, or in other words, but the doing of the law is not of faith. So the law, because it's an external code, if you want to live under the law, then you live by doing them. Well, how is that? Am I saying that you gain life? A person that is alive, that's a Jew under the law, they maintain their life, the blessing from God. And again, as you get into Deuteronomy chapter 27, 28, you see that, there's all kinds of benefits, as well as, health benefits and national benefits and protections. And, if you read aspects of the law where it talks about, God blessing your crops, or making sure that you prosper, and that doesn't mean like a big bank account necessarily, but like great crops, a good yielding, within their economy, which is an agrarian culture, and so you get that. Now, like if you went to Ezekiel 18, for example, and you read through that, you'd realize, well, if a person rebels against God, disobeys the law, then God can take his life. And he gives these examples. Now, Ezekiel 18 is talking about people that live righteously are blessed by God, and people that live unrighteously are going to be judged by God. This is under the law, because God was tired of people saying that we're being judged because of what our fathers do. The saying was, you know, um, our fathers ate grapes, but our teeth are set on edge. In other words, your teeth get grindy when you eat grapes. Um, well, they're saying, yeah, our fathers did this stuff, but we're the ones being judged for it. And God says, I don't judge you for what your fathers did. And then he gives the example. If a person, if a guy lives righteously, and then he gives these examples under the law, he says, then he'll live because he's living in them. This is what the verse is referring to. And then he says, however, if he lives unrighteously, and then he goes through the opposite examples of what you would do to disobey the law, he says, then basically he would, the person will die for their sins, right? He says, God says, Ezekiel 18:4, he says, all souls are mine. So as you read through Ezekiel, he gives you these 18, he gives you these different examples, and you realize what God is saying is, hey, and if a guy is righteous and he turns to be an unrighteous, then, he'll die. And then if a person is unrighteous, but if he repents, he'll live. In other words, this is how a man that does the law, obeys the law, lives in them. It gains him his life and the benefits of everything that God had promised. Okay. So that's why it's important to know these Old Testament chapters and Old Testament books, especially the law, because this sets a foundation for how it's used in the New Testament. Now in verse 4, it says, none of you shall approach anyone who is near of kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am Jehovah. In other words, you're not supposed to go near somebody within your family. And notice I wrote a little note. I put an arrow. It says incest, okay? Verse 7 says the nakedness of your father. He explains verse 6, the nakedness of your mother. You shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. Now, in verse 8, he says, the nakedness of your father's wife, indicating that it would not be your mother, okay? You shall not uncover. It is your father's nakedness. Now, I wrote my own reference there to 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1, because that was the problem they had. But in my other note, I wrote, this was common among the Medes and the Persians for many centuries. So for many centuries, the Medes and the Persians practiced stuff like this. Now, again, God is telling them what are the accepted and the unaccepted relationships. This is the purity that he is looking for from his people. So chapter 18 goes through that, and it goes through all different kind of essentially family relationships. He deals with polygamy, right? In verse 17, he says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter, nor shall you take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are near to kin to her. It is wickedness. Nor shall you take, verse 18, a woman as a rival to her sister to uncover her nakedness while the other is alive. So both of them dealing with an aspect of polygamy, and it's certainly a wickedness to just, marry some woman and then basically start having sex with all the girls in the family. Okay, that, we saw this in some cults, okay, that aren't really in existence anymore in our own country before. And this is the stuff, that the Bible lays out. But I want you to understand the reason that God had to spell this out and give them exactly how they were to relate to each other was because they were going into a land. They saw it in Egypt, right? As we saw in like verse 2 or 3. But they're going into a land that this is what they did. This is how they lived. They lived practicing all this. And, you need to realize that much of paganism and we see this today. Much of paganism, it's all wrapped around some perversion of sex. Because ultimately, what God is trying to do here is he's trying to establish proper family relationships so that the family unit stays strong, because that's what nations are made out of. You cannot make a nation out of single parent families or families that there is no marriage or loyalty. Like, you can't make a nation out of just everybody dating everybody or everybody having sex with everybody. But the reason that you see the move away from that in paganism is because the devil is behind paganism, and pagan concepts come out to try. Their whole goal is the design is to destroy family relationships. You break a family down and you'll break a nation down. We're watching it in our own country. Okay. Now, when we get to verse 19, it says also, starting kind of, another section, kind of outside of the initial family. And he says, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she is in her customary impurity. In other words, while she's having her time of the month. Moreover, you shall not lie carnally with your neighbor's wife to defile yourself with her. And, I wrote adultery next to it. That's what he's dealing with. Verse 21, you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am Jehovah. That would be murder. Sacrifice to Molech. Now, some commentators think that passing through the fire is really a dedication to Molech, which would be something that is counter to the worship of God alone. But the context works better with the aspect of the relationship being the sacrificing of children to Moloch, which they have archaeological evidence for. If you need that, you can go to Expedition Bible with Joel Kramer. It's on YouTube. He's got a channel, and search for the Canaanites or whatever and child sacrifice, and he'll show you the the graves that they've uncovered and everything else in the Valley of Tophet. But anyways, now in verse 22, these are verses that people in the world love to quote to criticize the Bible. Okay. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. That's verse 22. Verse 23. Nor shall you mate with any animal to defile yourself with it. So one is homosexuality, the other is bestiality. Nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is perversion. So it's an abomination. Homosexuality is obviously, bestiality is it's a perversion. It's really as sick as you can get. Now, the worship of the animal worship was really focused towards Ashtoreth, and the bestiality was from the he-goat that the Egyptians used to worship. So again, this is stuff that the Jews saw in Egypt, and they were not supposed to repeat it, but obviously they were doing it also in the land of Canaan. And then verse 24, he says, do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. In other words, the Canaanites, I'm getting them out of the land because this is what they're doing. And he goes on to say, if you do the same thing, like, I'll take you out of the land, right? And eventually they did. He says, verse 25, for the land is defiled, therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it. In other words, he is judging them for what they're doing, and the land vomits out the inhabitants. You, verse 26, shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, either any of your own nation, nor any stranger who dwells among you. In other words, if people come from another nation and they want to live with you, then they convert to proselytize into Judaism, and they're held by the same standards that every Jew is. Okay, so they can't come in and do what they want. You can't have people. So God was against foreigners coming into the nation of Israel, into the land, inside their borders, and doing what they wanted. They had to comply and worship the God of Israel, as a Jew did, and be under the law. Otherwise, they were not allowed in. It was really that simple. Okay, so there's no question as to what God was doing with his own people. Now, again, we can draw principles from this all through the Bible. Each nation has borders. People were not just allowed to come in and destroy everything that God was doing. Okay. I find it interesting. We have a school in the church, and there are requirements for admission. At least one parent has to be a believer, all right, and needs to be going to a Bible teaching church. That's not just any church, but a church that's recognized as a Bible teaching church, because then you at least have one parent that is standing behind what you're doing. And at times we've had families come in because other schools, closed down around the area, private schools, some Christian, and they want to send their kids to a Christian school because they like the morality, they like the setting, the environment. They know their kids aren't going to be, given drugs and doing all this other stuff, and so they like the morality and that aspect of it. However, they're not believers. They're not Christians. So they don't really meet the requirement. And sometimes you'll get, a guy that has a good job or whatever, and he'll say, hey, I'll bring a lot of money into the school if you let my kid in. And the problem is that if you do that, then what you're doing is you're allowing a family to come in, and a kid from an unsaved family, and if the kid's old enough and unsaved, then bringing the world in with them. And then, Christian kids struggle as it is. They don't need the help, right? So, if you keep letting people in that have entirely different ideals and views and worldviews and everything else, what ends up happening is the very reason that you wanted to bring your child there in the first place goes away, because you become no different than the public schools. In other words, the environment is changed and it's watered down as enough unsaved kids come into the school and just make it like the world that they come from. So there's no sense in having a Christian school anymore. That's my point. So there'd be no use to the nation of Israel to bring the Word of God or the Messiah of God into the world to teach them about God, his righteousness, his holiness. Holiness is separation from, sin and corruption and everything. There would be nothing to keep them from basically ruining the nation of Israel and preventing the Messiah from ever coming. They just water the whole thing down. They change the dynamics of the whole nation, and God wasn't going to allow it. So, and he goes on to tell them that. Now, as we move forward in this, right, we will get to the next slide, which is chapter 19, the third picture. And in 19, it moves into, different, the heading says number 3, idolatry forbidden. But I wrote a note next to chapter 19, verse 1. It says, proper relationship with the holy God involves responsibility and a measure, which is hard to read, a measure of effort. This is to be counted as a privilege. So what God does in chapter 19, again, he's still dealing with purity laws with the Jews. He's saying, look, there's a responsibility to having a relationship with God. And, you know, this is something that needs to be carefully understood. So if we look at the first few verses in 19, it says, and Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation, so it's for everybody, of the children of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I am the Lord, I am Jehovah your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am Jehovah your God. Do not turn to idols, nor make yourselves molten images. I am Jehovah your God. Now, think about this for a second. In these few verses, he basically recaps the first table of the law, the first table of the first four commandments. So you get, he does the first five, but so the first one is no other gods. Second one is no graven images. Third one is not taking the Lord's name in vain. The fourth one is keep the Sabbath. And the fifth one is to honor your parents, obey them, right? So you have that in these first four verses. Obviously, no other gods, right? And no graven images, right? Not going to have any idols. Number three, not taking the Lord's name in vain. That is, be holy, for I Jehovah am your God, am holy. Because again, in other words, I want you living the way I'm living, in a sense. I want you separate from the world's corruption. I'm separate from it. I want you representing me. So you're not taking the name of the Lord in an empty fashion. And number four, keep the Sabbaths, right? He says, I want you to keep my Sabbaths. And then, though it's in front of it, he says, I want you to revere your mother and father. Interesting, mother is listed first, maybe because they typically had a closer relationship with kids. But, then he moves into the peace offering, and how it's performed and eaten. In verse 5, verse 9, heading number 5, it says provision for unfortunate, right? And then God goes into talking about how you're not supposed to deal falsely with people and everything else. Verse 12 is interesting, and you shall not swear by my name falsely, right? Nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am Jehovah, right? Again, that's commandment number 3. So you can see there are commands that are extractions, in a sense, of the original 10 commandments, which if you were to read through this as a Jew, and you can read through it as a Christian too, but as a Jew, this is how you were living, and you would understand how these are all connected back to Sinai, right? It really is amazing. Heading number 6, top right, it says, righteous actions demanded. Verse 15, he says, you shall do no injustice in judgment, right? You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, in other words, a gossip, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am Jehovah. So again, as we go through this, talks about vengeance and everything else. I have referenced next to verse 15, Matthew 7, next to verse 17, Matthew 5:22, next to verse 18, Matthew 5:23, because this is what Jesus is referring to in the Sermon on the Mount. Like, he's not just pulling this stuff out of the ether, he's pulling it out of the Old Testament. He's trying to help them understand how to apply the law that they were under properly. Now, as a Christian, we can extract those principles very easily as believers. I don't have to be under the Old Testament law to know what God doesn't want as far as me wrongly treating my neighbor or being unjust or whatever, right? So as we get to the next picture, chapter 20, if you look on the bottom there, it says regulations about human sacrifices, spiritism, and various immoralities. And that's again, because this is the application of the morality that he wants his people to follow, or the holiness or the purity, right? Remember how purity was going to be laid out. Again, the world takes issue with this stuff because in this chapter, because it's talking about certain idolatries, it goes in to talk about people that are put to death. So capital punishment, they didn't have penal institutions in Israel and in Canaan. So if you committed any of these crimes, only within the nation of Israel. This isn't for the whole world. This is within the nation of Israel. These were capital crimes because God was using the nation of Israel in particular to accomplish his purpose. Now, they were serving him in this, right? And as they did this, there were certain people, and again, you can read through this list as easily as me, but I did write some notes next to some of these verses so they're easy to kind of capture with your eye. Verse 6, it says, and a person who turns to mediums and familiar spirits to prostitute himself with them, I will set my face against that person and cut him off from his people. And that is either out of the land or capital punishment. In verse 7, he says, consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am Jehovah your God. In other words, I'm holy. Like, this is why I'm not telling you to do anything I'm not, right? And then he says to keep his statutes and perform them because he says in verse 8, I am Jehovah who sanctifies you. I'm the one that sets you apart from all this stuff. You should be following me. Do what I'm telling you. Verse 9, everyone who curses his father and his mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother, his blood shall be upon him. When it says his blood shall be upon him, that means they're responsible for their own death. In other words, they took an action that caused it. When Noah got off the ark in chapter Genesis 9, God said, anybody that takes somebody's life, they shed their blood should be shed. So again, in other words, it's capital punishment. And what God was saying to Noah is he's saying, look, if they murder somebody, then they're forfeiting their own life. They need to understand this ahead of time. Like, they can't just go out and destroy the image of God in some person and take their life off this planet. Now, capital punishment's not murder. Capital punishment is justice, because it's exacting the justice that God demands on the person, because God made that person that was murdered in his image, and the other person destroyed that in this world. I mean, the person goes on to live in the next world, but that, the murderer destroys the image of God in that person. And, God may have wanted to use that person in some way, but this other person got in the way and committed murder. Well, so you're not supposed to commit demonism, right? Idolatry, and then obviously here, this is a sin against parents, and curses his father and his mother is a pretty severe thing, because you're getting to the place where you're really trying to ruin your family. Okay, doesn't just mean they swore at them. They're calling a curse typically upon their parents or upon themselves if they don't exact some kind of damage to their parents or something. In other words, these kids are out of control. All right. Later on, it'll expand to explain that they're gluttons and wine bibbers. So basically, they're gluttons and basically party animals that are a menace to society, out of control, and the parents can't do anything with them. Okay. And so you can't just you can't just let Portland, Oregon happen for 180 days. God stops it. It's put to bed right away. And that's what's going to happen in the 1,000-year reign. When Jesus returns, Things are going to be set in order, and people are not going to be allowed to just run rampant and do wickedness and evil. He said he's going to rule with a rod of iron. That means an enforced righteousness where people cannot do evil just because they want to. There's a measure that God allows them during this time of the world. However, there's coming a time when that's going to end. Okay. And then again, the world criticizes some of this stuff that's in here, but it deals with adultery again, and they're put to death. Incest, they're put to death. Verse 12, homosexuality, right? 13, if a man lies with a male as he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. It's their own fault, basically, is what it's saying. And if a man marries a woman, which is the next, marries her mother, this is incestual polygamy. It is wickedness. They shall be burned with fire. That's certainly put to death, right? So that there's no more wickedness among you. Like this has to be eliminated. And again, bestiality is brought into it. They're put to death. So what was said earlier in chapter 19 that they couldn't do these things, here it says the punishment of them. Okay, so this is like a package deal, these chapters. Again, incest in chapter 17, verse 17, talks about the menstrual time and the punishment for that. In verse 18, again, incest in 19, and some of the consequences of coming upon certain people that have unlawful relationships, that they end up being childless, right? So he says here in verse 22, so therefore, like understanding all this stuff, therefore keep my statutes and all my judgments and perform them, that the land where I am bringing you to dwell may not vomit you out. I want you to stay in there because I'm not going to be partial. If you come in and you do the same thing as the people that are in there now that I'm throwing out, I'll throw you out. And he did for 70 years, right? To Babylon. And in verse 25, he is drawing a conclusion. Again, I can't get into every detail here, but he says, you shall therefore distinguish between clean animals and unclean, between unclean birds and clean and all that, right? Verse 26, and you shall be holy to me, for I, Jehovah, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. They were God's special people that he had a specific purpose for. That's why he created the nation. Verse 27, kind of in conclusion, a man or a woman who is a medium or has a familiar spirit, or has familiar spirits, in other words, demon-possessed, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. So now in chapter 21, notice the heading in blue, laws regulating the priesthood and the 7 great feasts of the Hebrew calendar. And that goes in through chapter 23, which we're not going to get to. However, I wanted you to see how 21 moves to the priests, right? And Jehovah said to Moses, speak to the priests, chapter 21, verse 1, the sons of Aaron, not all the Levites, these are the priests, the sons of Aaron, say to them, none shall defile himself for the dead among the people. And so he goes through and he explains what they can and can't do, who they can marry. Priests could only marry a virgin. They couldn't be a harlot. And, certain things were off the table for them. Now, as we go through this, I want you to notice in chapter 1, we move into the priesthood where it's laws and ceremonies for the priests. We move from instructions to the people in chapter 18 to 20 to the priesthood in chapter 21. So this again is a reminder. These are on the other side of the Day of Atonement, notice it goes chapter 21 to 22, specifically talking about the priests. And I want you to notice the balance in the chapters. For the people, like chapters 11 to 15, if we go back here, notice 11 to 15 is the other sides of the purity laws and ceremonies for people, okay? And the holiness in chapter 11 relates to foods, all right? Like clean and unclean animals, what you can and can't eat, or, the Jews. In chapter 12, it was holiness that relates to motherhood, the sacrifices offered for bearing children. Now you'd say, well, why would you have to do that? I mean, there's cute little babies, but from God's standpoint, from his holiness and righteousness, another sinner was brought into the world. As cute and beautiful as those babies are, they have a sin nature, and they're going to sin. So they're going to eventually be accountable to God. And so everything that has to do with reproduction is addressed, interestingly enough, in some of these chapters, because, I mean, if you notice, so much of the what was explained not to do in chapter like 19 and 20, 18, 19, and 20, but 19 and 20 for like, family relationships and incest and all this other stuff. And it's like, you can't do all this. You can't commit adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, all this stuff, right? It's all sex. And then you get into, chapter 20, and then it's the judgment for like committing these certain acts. It's really pretty specific. Now, this is prior to the Day of Atonement in the middle, but again, we're relating to clean and unclean foods. It's not that they're committing an immorality, like foods that are clean and unclean were ceremonially unclean. A lot of the animals really dealt with like dead things and ate dead things, and God wanted the Jews to kind of be away from that. And so he had kind of removed that from them. Okay. He wanted them, he's the God of life. He wanted to be associated like that. Same thing with chapter 12 with motherhood. They're bearing children, but again, they're bringing children into the world, sinners bearing sinners. And again, it's the kind of fruition of the relationship of sex, right? Even though it's within marriage. Holiness in chapter 13 and 14 relate to identifying leprosy, and it's cleansing the lepers, their home, and what they do going to the priests, because this is something, again, though a person, it's not their fault they got leprosy, but they became unclean, all right? Holiness in chapter 15 relates to both men and women's bodily discharges. For men, it doesn't get specific as to what it is, but it seems like discharges that are coming from sexual organs, and then it specifically talks about semen. And then for women, their menstrual time, and if their menstrual time extended or they had a problem where they continued to bleed, this created an unclean situation. And again, they had to deal with ultimately offering sacrifices and all that, but it made them ceremonially unclean for certain lengths of time or whatever, or while they were in a particular condition, before that they could kind of come back in with everybody else. So the holiness addressed in these chapters, these 11 through 15, are not personal immorality. If a person gets leprosy, it's not because they're in sin necessarily, right? In chapters 18 to 20, but in chapters 18 to 20, it's holiness that makes a person. Let me read that again. Holiness addressed in these chapters are not personal immorality, as in 18 to 20, but holiness that makes a person ceremonially unclean. Like they're not committing sins. They'd be committing sins if they do something they're not supposed to do. But, like this is not, because they're having a wrong sexual relationship necessarily in that way. So God determines, for example, unclean animals that are off the diet, right? God determines the sacrifices for bearing children according to his righteousness and holiness. God commands to be fruitful and multiply. So he tells them he wants people to bear children, but they still have to offer sacrifices for when they have a child. Leprosy, which is a type of sin, and, types are all that which are an example of something else, are not caused by people on purpose. It's like getting cancer. A person doesn't cause their own illness, but they do have to deal with it in a particular way, the leprosy, that is, once they had it. Bodily discharges are not something necessarily a person could help. They could do something wrong and have a problem, but not necessarily all the time. It could happen. You can get a urinary tract infection, but that doesn't mean that they're doing something necessarily wrong. Each of these situations require ceremonial cleansing. That's in chapter 11 to 15 for a relationship with God, because we're sinners by nature. So these ones prior to Yom Kippur, chapter 16 and 17, 11 to 15, these chapters, they had to deal with these issues to maintain their relationship with God properly, because they're still sinners, okay? And sinners have to relate to God in a prescribed way. Then it's separated in the middle by Yom Kippur, and then it gets to the other side. So I wanted to, this is a commentary. I'll quickly read it to you because, we're coming up on an hour, and I really didn't intend for this to go that long. But anyways, regarding chapter 15, which really deals with, like animals and stuff like that. But it says, deals with the final subject of clean and unclean discharges from the reproductive organs. And it really is, chapter 11 starts the animals up through 15. Negative feeling of defilements, yet totally beyond the choices of a person. It also focuses on the greatest area of privilege and responsibility in a personal life of a man or a woman under God. There are no more basic areas of life than the first and the last of the unclean instructions, eating and reproduction. So eating in chapter 11 up through 15, which you can read those on your own, right? Chapter 15. Verse 32 summarizes the contents of the chapter. People are in a sinful condition by a part of the sinful world. It was not originally by their own choice, but now contributing by their choices. Important. They are affected by others' sins and affecting others by their sins. Whether others know our sinful thoughts and actions, God knows. He expects us to repent. The most basic life activities carry the reminder of separation from God apart from his grace because of his holiness. When the sexual organs do not function normally, the negative association is a reminder of the potential for sinful corruption in sexual relations, which is in opposition to the intent of the Holy Creator. All abnormal blood flow, and that would be the woman's part in the second part of the chapter, suggests the threat of death and reminds one to be ready to meet the Creator and Judge of the universe. Everyone continually needs God's forgiveness and promise of eternal life. God holds sexual intercourse as one of the highest gifts to humanity, with some of the greatest personal responsibility. The potentially life-begetting act must never be entered into lightly. This most intimate of expressions between a man and a woman must be kept in the privacy of the marriage bed and away from public worship. So God lays out these distinctions. I mean, it's just genius, actually, the way he does it. And so there was an understanding of all this stuff. Like people could put sex into a proper category. Turek always says, sex is like fire, right? Fire is good in the fireplace. It gets out, you burn the house down. Sex is good in marriage. You use it out of marriage, you burn the house down. Basically, everything goes wrong, and it's nothing but crisis and problems and everything else. So this commentary is from the Complete Biblical Library. So I just thought they did a good job summarizing chapter 15, which is why I wanted to read it to you. So again, there's the basic layout. If we had gone back into chapter 8 to 10, it would be the priests, establishing, what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to offer their sacrifices. And then it picks up in 21 and 22, more specifics on what their roles were. So as we look at this, Leviticus 18, right? We went through those, and the last picture, notice the heading of the Bible, separation of the priests. And that's in chapter 22, because again, it's dealing with 21 and 22 with the priesthood. I put a note in there in blue. I don't know if you can read it. It says the last chapter, persons not qualified to be priests. This chapter, the limits of those qualified. So in chapter 21, it talks about people who are not qualified, who had something wrong with them. Again, not their own, they could be born like that or whatever, but because God always, he could not be represented by something that showed the results in corruption of sin. Again, so instructive, right? And the priests that are qualified in chapter 22, it talks about their limits. I mean, I have a note after verse 2. It says you have to act as a priest at all times. I mean, they needed to be the same all the time. In verse 4, it says, whatever man of the descendants of Aaron, right? And again, there's ceremonial uncleanness, right? That it's talking about who is a leper. He's ceremonially unclean, right? Or as a discharge or whatever. You get down to verse 9, it says, they, talking about the priests, shall therefore keep my ordinance, lest they bear sin for it and die thereby. If they profane it, I, Jehovah, sanctify them. And I put a little note there, immoral uncleanness for being disobedient. Okay, so each one falls under kind of a different category. Talks about, eating the results of a holy sacrifice. Another family member couldn't in verse 10. Verse 11, if they're incorporated into the family, then they can. So, this isn't, these are ceremonial aspects, but they're mixed with morality. So it's just interesting the way it all lays out. And so as we list it out here, notice all these chapters connected with the Ten Commandments, and we extracted moral principles and God's will for each of us. I mean, we could go through there and say, well, obviously, if God doesn't like the Jews doing this, I can extract the principle that, if he wants the priests acting like priests at all time, what's that tell me as a Christian? Peter tells us we're a kingdom of priests. Jesus is our high priest. Because we have access to God through Christ, we're all priests. Every New Testament believer is a priest. Well, I should be the same at all times. I shouldn't be drunk sometimes or committing immorality another time or doing this or doing that. I can extract that principle very, very easily from these verses that we're reading. So as we watch God lay down these principles of morality and righteousness for people in certain positions, it tells us something, okay? When we see somebody, if a priest can't represent God because he is deformed physically, Like he can't legitimately do priestly functions, offering sacrifice. Um, he can't help that he was born that way. But what it tells us is that God can't be represented by somebody, in a sense, as a priest that has the marks of sin. And so, or the results of sin. In other words, not his sin, but just this is the results of sin in the world. And this is not what was to be, you know, served before God. And so we see people, obviously, I mean, I had an older brother that was born mentally retarded, but I mean, he didn't look like he was. He had the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck when he was a kid, when he was born. In 1949, before they had all the technology to know that was happening. And, so it caused him to be mentally handicapped. And but it wasn't his fault, but that is the result of just general sin in the world, and that we are sinners. This is the damage it caused. I have beta thalassemia. It's just it's an inherited genetic um, anemia, right? I get my blood tests, and they never, they flag the blood counts and all this other stuff, and the size of the you know the blood cells that are in your that are flowing and everything else, and so you get them flagged because they're the wrong size or whatever. That's never going to change. I will always be genetically anemic, and I can't take more iron to fix it, because you can't fix the genetics. But that's because my ancestry is from the Mediterranean area, which is where that disease comes from. I inherited it. It is what it is, right? But that's the result of sin in the world. It's not because I had prenatal sin or something like that. That's ridiculous. But it answers, why is this happening? Well, I got stuck with that because of that reason, right? The priests in the Old Testament are a picture of New Testament believers and the responsibility we have as Christians to represent our Lord in holiness and spiritual living. So pretty clear, I think. But again, I just wanted to take a couple of chapters here, kind of look at them. I think it's helpful as we're doing this overview to realize there's a lot more in here than I think we give the Bible credit for. It's not impossible to understand. You can go through the book of Leviticus. You may not be able to kind of track with all the way they cut up the sacrifices and all that stuff. You don't have to. I mean, if you want to, you can. But the key is to understanding the sacrifices, what they're there for and everything. We talked about that in the last video when we went through Leviticus, what they're there for. So anyways, hopefully this was helpful. We'll start Numbers next time. And until then, sorry for going a couple minutes over, but until then, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.